Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at creating a landscape planet surface uh, using Mudbox. The first thing I'm going to do is create some terrain by making a polygon plane. And because I'm going to need more resolution on it, I'm going to press Shift D a couple times. And I'll start doing my sculpting. As always, remember to work on layers when sculpting. That'll give you a lot more versatility. Now for my planet surface that I'm going to create, I'm going to use the Sculpt tool, and I'll go to my stencils, and I'm going to use this stencil here. So this will give me a nice surface to begin with to create a mountain, which I'm going to have on my planet surface here. The next thing I'm going to do is use my grab tool to pull out the mountain that I'll have on my surface here. And maybe I'll use the amplify tool to get a little bit more definition in this terrain on my mountain surface here. I think the next tool I'll use will be the scrape tool. I'm going to scrape off some of this terrain around the mountain so that we get a little bit more variety, a little bit more different types of surface areas, some rough, some being smooth. The scrape will take away the high areas and create these canyon-like areas on the planet surface here. And another tool that I will use to do kind of the opposite is the fill tool. This will fill in some of the crevices on my mountain. The next thing I'm going to do is start painting my textures. So I'm going to go over to my paint tools. I'll also switch over to my paint layers, and I'm going to create a new material for this. Perhaps I'll give this a name. I'll call it mountain material. And I might set some of its base properties here. I'll create a layer to start painting on, and I will be painting on the diffuse layer. So in other words, the color layer. You can in fact have multiple diffuse layers. I'm going to create an additional diffuse layer here. And on this layer, I'm going to paint some snow or frozen water on my planet here. I'm going to use a stamp, and I'll choose my snow color. After painting some of the color texture on there, I may choose to go back to sculpting some more. I'm going to define my flowing glaciers a little bit more, perhaps by using the wax tool. As I'm sculpting, I may sometimes also adjust the lighting just to see how it's capturing the light when I move it. And when you're creating your landscape, you can think both like a photographer, where you can compose your scene by strategically placing the camera, but you can also think as a set designer because you control how your viewer is going to see this. So I'm going to create another piece of terrain. I will temporarily hide this one and create another polygon plane. I'll increase the resolution on it as well. And I'll also create a sculpt layer for this part of my terrain as well. This terrain is going to be the foreground of my landscape that I'm creating. So I'll now start going through the sculpting process for the foreground. With the beginning of my foreground here, I'll go ahead and make visible the mountain that I created earlier. And now I need to start thinking about camera placement. What I might do is create a new camera here, which I'll name. And I'll look through this camera. And as I start placing my camera where I want it for this landscape that I'm creating, then I will also go and take some of these objects that I have here, go to my select move, and move them in this 3D space. Now that I've arranged the terrain somewhat like I want it and also have placed the camera, I'll continue working a little bit more on the sculpting of the foreground. Now that I've done a little bit more on the foreground, I'm going to work on the texture for it. So I'll right click on the geometry and create a new material. So I spent a little bit more time doing some sculpting as well as painting my textures, just some slight modifications, and we'll now move on to the next part. So what I'm going to do is select my camera. I'll expand on that and go to Image Plane, and I'm going to import an image that I created in Photoshop of some stars for my background. I'm going to take this image and send it to the back by adjusting the depth here, and I'll scale up the image. And perhaps move it up slightly as well. Now, the next step is to play around with the lighting. So I'm going to select my light that I have in the scene, and I'm going to turn on the show grips and show light so that I get a better idea of how I'm adjusting this light. I may play around with the color of the light as well as the intensity of the light as well. And we may choose to turn on cast shadows. Now that I've arranged the light, I'm going to create a second light, which I'm going to use just to add a little bit of light to these areas of shadow. Very, very subtle, however, and we'll see how that looks. And finally, to create my render, I'm going to hide the grid and go ahead and create my render. And here is the render that I've created. Now, before wrapping up this video, we'll take a look at a couple more things. What I'd like to show you is the camera bookmarks here. As you can see, there are no bookmarks, but because I've spent some time positioning this camera and I don't want to lose that position, what I can do is click on this arrow here and say Add Camera Bookmark. I'll name it. And now, if I move around in this viewport here and want to get back to that camera position, I can simply click on it and it'll bring me right back. This can in fact be a useful means for saving a number of different camera positions if we want to play around with our composition. For instance, I can save this view here. And now I can easily switch between my two cameras. And finally, I'd like to take a look at the viewport filters, which are found here. You'll notice that there are a number of them here. We'll take a look at a couple of them. Well, we can click on all of them actually, but we'll only talk about a few of them. Here's the tone mapper. Depth of field. Depth of field is a nice one if you want to get a sense of there being depth of field. If we select the depth of field here, you can adjust it using these three sliders. We can adjust the depth of field, the amount of depth of field, as well as the focus distance. So if I want my foreground in sharper focus, but perhaps I want this still not entirely out of focus, I'll play around with that number a little bit. We can also adjust the blur amount. I'm going to uncheck depth of field so that we can take a look at a couple of these other examples here. We've got cavity ambient occlusion and ambient occlusion, and you can try both of those out. Again, we have different parameters that we can adjust with each one of those different viewport filters. What this is doing, what both of these are doing to some degree, is taking those areas, those crevices and cracks in our modeling and making them darker to accentuate them more, to give more of that three-dimensional feel to them. We also have screen distance, which simply indicates the distance due to the gray or white or black values here. The darker the gradient, the further away it is. We've got normal map, and finally the non-photorealistic viewport filter. So that's just a very quick run through the viewport filters, but another thing that is worthwhile to explore and experiment with. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you next time.